As Canada celebrates its 150th birthday, we asked historian and biographer Charlotte Gray to offer up her picks for the 5 most important people who helped give Ontario, one of 4 founding Canadian provinces, its sense of itself. Charlotte Gray is the author most recently of The Promise of Canada, 150 Years, People and Ideas That Have Shaped Our Country, and she joins us now for more. Okay, you ready for your top 5?
Ready.
Here we go. You've got Joseph Brant, the Mohawk leader, at the top of your list. Tell us why.
Joseph Brant, an extraordinary statesman, an extraordinary loyalist who in the 18th century made sure that, in fact, his people from the Six Nations, because he was a Mohawk, stayed loyal to Britain. What is really hard to understand is why he did stay loyal to Britain, given how badly he was treated, actually, by the colonial authorities, by the British North Americans. And yet he fought and fought to ensure the survival of Indians, and he made sure they got this huge Six Nations on the Grand River Reserve when they just came north to stay British.
Do we have a sense about why he stayed loyal to Britain, even though it was not reciprocated?
I think he was very traditional in many ways. He'd been to London. He admired a lot about Britain. He was an extraordinarily talented individual. He translated the Bible. He spoke from English into Mohawk. He spoke 3 Indigenous languages. He was graceful. He admired much about Britain, but he also felt that some aspects of British society were horrendous. And at one point he said to one of his British interlocutors, "Stop calling us savage until you stop being such savages yourself."
Well said. Number 2 on your list is Adelaide Hoodless. Now, I have a sister-in-law who taught at Adelaide Hoodless School in Hamilton, so I know who she is, but you go ahead and tell everybody else.
She founded or helped found 3 different organizations for women in the early 20th century at a point when women were often just sort of stuck in their homes, particularly on isolated farms, with very little opportunity to get together. She founded the National YWCA, she founded the National Council of Women, and she was also a founder of the Women's Institutes, which became a worldwide movement. She was insistent that women should be taught domestic science so that they really could feed their children properly and contribute to the well-being of the province. And I have to say that one of the reasons that I chose Adelaide Hoodless is that the Women's Institute in Britain was an incredibly important part of village life, and my mother was a leading member.
Okay, fair. And this is a woman whose roots go back to the middle part of the 19th century. So
yes.
She was really far ahead of her time in what she was preaching.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, number 3, anybody who drives down University Avenue in Toronto will see this man's statue and may have no idea what he did, but he was huge. Adam Beck.
Adam Beck, who was the power knight, Sir Adam, because he was the person who gave southwestern Ontario cheap electricity. I mean, I realise sort of a little ironic today to talk about Ontario Hydro, given what's happened in the last few years. But it was an incredible institution in the early 20th century where, in fact, he established a public utility that municipalities signed on to so that all the towns around Toronto and Toronto itself got cheap electricity. It allowed for incredible growth of manufacturing plant. I mean, he was a big bullying guy who drove his colleagues mad. At one point, he was actually a minister in the government, and at one point the Premier said he wanted Ontario Hydro to work for the government, not the government to work for Ontario Hydro. But he made a huge difference to people's lives. He brought electricity to farms, to the outlying communities. He, in fact, brought the 20th century into Ontario's lives.
And I think when he was in Hearst Cabinet 100 years ago, he got the hydroelectric station in Niagara Falls going, and it was the biggest construction site in the Western Hemisphere at the time.
It was extraordinary, those vast turbines.
All right, number 4 on your list is Margaret Atwood. No surprise here, really. She deserves to be there, doesn't she?
Well, absolutely. Margaret Atwood, in fact, has she sort of competes with Alice Munro for introducing the rest of the world to Ontario. But the reason I chose Margaret Atwood is that she was one of the very first authors who put Toronto and Ontario stories into books which were sold worldwide. You know, whether it's the streets of Toronto in the 1960s in The Edible Woman, or whether when she went back into Ontario history for Alias Grace. In each case, people were reading about somewhere that they might otherwise know nothing about. And she's also always promoted other writers from Ontario, from Canada, in the most loyal and patriotic way. She didn't have to do that when she was promoting her own books.
Now, number 5 on your list, this is, I imagine he's on your list just to prove that you're not some old fuddy-duddy, right? Because this is The Weeknd. And for those who don't know The Weeknd, that's not a misprint. He does not spell his name with 3 E's. It's just 2. And he's very hot right now, isn't he?
The Weeknd is extremely hot. Young Ethiopian guy from Scarborough, Abel Tesfaye, and he is still in his 20s, but he is really, I chose him because he represents the new Ontario, certainly the new Toronto, because he comes from Scarborough, where more than 50% of that community were born outside the country or don't speak English as their first language. And he's so, I mean, he was promoted by Drake. He's hugely successful as a musician and still very loyal to Canada. I also like him because the way that sort of North American culture just absorbs and gobbles up any completely new influence. So I'm thinking about, you know, who symbolizes the new Canada, our extraordinary multicultural society. And I Google him and I discover, oh, one of his songs was on the soundtrack for the movie 50 Shades of Grey. So, I mean, how much more integrated can you become?
50 Shades of Grey, and your name is Charlotte Gray. Is there any connection there?
There are so many more shades of grey in my life.
Just checking. All right. Now, here's where we're going to get into some arguments, okay? Because obviously, if you're going to say The Weeknd and you're going to the world of music, some people are going to say, why not Neil Young? Why not Gordon Lightfoot? So why not?
Because you asked me for 5, not 10.
So if I'd said 10, you would have, okay, they might have made the cut.
Definitely Neil Young.
There's no hockey players on this list. How come?
Because you'll do the hockey players.
That's my responsibility?
That's your responsibility.
All right, I get it. I mean, I can think of only about 1,000 who I could put on a list of top 5. More bluntly, there's no well, okay, Adam Beck was in the cabinet, but he's not known formally as a politician. There's no politicians on this list. We've had prime ministers and premiers from Ontario. How come none on your list?
You know, ever since I started writing about Canadian history, I've always wanted to go to the places where others have not necessarily gone. We have a wealth of people, brilliant historians and biographers, who start with the politicians because they have had such an important role in this province and in this country. But I've always felt somebody else is going to deal with them. I want to make sure that the people whose contribution has been just as important to, you know, the people at the bottom of the socio-economic spectrum. I want to make sure that the Adelaide Hoodlesses are recognised, or that Joseph Brant is recognised, along with all the obvious people like Oliver Mowat or Bill Davis. You'll do them. I'll do my people.
Deal.
Deal.
That's good. Okay, yeah, because I'd have put Bill Davis on the list, obviously, but I understand why you didn't. That's understandable. Charlotte Gray, this was great. The Promise of Canada is your book, and that's your top 5 Ontarians. And we should say that we would love to hear what you thought of Charlotte's list and your own picks of the 5 most important Ontarians since 1867. So post them on our Twitter account or on our Facebook page, and we'll keep the discussion going. Charlotte, thanks.
Thank you, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.